So as I grow older, I have come to admit to myself a certain realization, a certain truth of the reality that the sum of my knowledge in what I know is actually rather minuscule and laughable compared to what I don't know. In other words, the older I get, the more I don't know. And there is so much I don't know. I don't know if the barbecue is better in Memphis or in Kansas City. I don't know whether the Dallas Cowboys are going to win another game this season. I don't know if the ending of the Game of Thrones was as bad as people said it was. I don't know if the Electoral College is a good thing for democracy or not. And the pandemic of COVID-19 has certainly brought home this reality of what I don't really know. I don't know, as much as I try to protect myself and my loved ones around me, whether we will get coronavirus or not. I don't know when the vaccines will finally be developed and how long it will take for them to be distributed to the general population. I don't know when things might come back to some semblance of normality. To live in these days and times is to live in uncertainty and not knowing. So I am overwhelmed by what I don't know, and especially at this time, as of this recording of this sermon, I do not know the results of our election for president. I do know a few things in terms of that election. I do know that no matter what the result, there will be people hurting and despairing. I do know that whatever the result of the election, I do know that people will still be angry and still be divided. And I do know that whatever happens, there is still a long and winding road to some form of reconciliation, some path of healing as we move forward as a country and as a society. And I must confess, as I preach this sermon, I don't know what to say. You may not be surprised by that. I don't know how to speak to the hurt and despair and the anger and division. I shared with Bob Hauser this week that I had this fantasy in my mind in the midst of, especially on election night and the uncertainty of the decisions, that maybe this would be a good time where I take a 2-week vacation. Let him speak to this moment. I don't think he was too excited about the idea, though he'd probably do a better job than me. I don't know what to say, but I know I do need to try and say something to this moment. The parable we read this morning is part of the lectionary reading, that revolving list of scriptures we read over a 3-year period of time. And this particular Sundays, when I was doing worship planning, I had not thought particularly about what that text would be and how helpful it would be, or not helpful, how it might say something to this moment. And as it was read to you this morning, you're probably shaking your head as much as I am. Leighton Williams, in a recent article in the Christian Century wrestling with this text, points out how this is really a tough parable to read right now. In the midst of such a season, he's speaking particularly of COVID-19, but it applies this week as well. Because Jesus offers an ominous story of a belated wedding feast and the exclusion of those who are unprepared for it. It's kind of a metaphor for our call to expectant waiting on God and the coming of God's kingdom. And the paradigm it suggests seems far from the notions of grace and mercy we often hear Jesus pray about, his message of inclusion that are always present in Jesus' teaching. This parable seems to contradict that. And as we look at the details of this parable, it's a little hard for us to read and understand, in part because the role of bridesmaids in welcoming the bridegroom is one that doesn't equate to our weddings these days. It doesn't resonate with how we understand weddings, so that element of this story is largely lost on us. And while the 5 apparently foolish bridesmaids take the blame in this story, missing out on the celebration, the banquet as a result, the bridegroom faces no consequences for leaving 10 women alone in the night far past his expected arrival time. Not to mention that after making everyone wait for so long, the bridegroom doesn't even wait long enough for those 5 oil-deprived bridesmaids to return. And more, the 5 wise bridesmaids, they don't catch any flack for their lack of generosity towards the others. I don't know what to make of this story, other than to wrestle with the issue at heart in this story. The people we're supposed to identify with, those foolish bridesmaids who did not have enough oil to sustain their flame. And when the bridegroom comes to invite them into the party, they're not ready. Because I think that's what Jesus is pointing at. That's the lesson here. And if you think about it, it is at the heart of our own struggle today, is it not? Do we have to ask ourselves, do we have enough oil in the lamps of our lives to sustain the flame through the darkness of the night until God's kingdom arrives? A kingdom where all people are welcomed and embraced, and the divisions of race and creed and political party don't matter anymore. That all experience being God's children together. And so the parable asks us, do we have enough oil in our lamps to face the coming months, the coming years, as we seek that kingdom together? All of us, even in our divided and uncertain times. One of the questions hounding me this week as I wrestled with this parable is a question that seemed obvious to me. What is this oil that sustains us, that keeps our flames burning? What might the oil in the lamps be a metaphor for us in this time, especially when we're supposed to have enough of it? And as I did a little research and read some commentaries, the answer to that question was as varied as the interpretations one might read in those commentaries. There is no one answer, and maybe that's right. But I do know that the oil that sustains us is not fear. I do know that the oil that sustains us is not anger. I do know that the oil that sustains us is not despair. What I think we need to realize and live into and believe and should be full of is that the oil that sustains us is compassion. It's peace. It's hope. It's justice for all. That is the oil that will sustain us and light up the night. And in fact, that image of the darkness, them waiting in the darkness, really resonates with me. It's because we certainly feel a time of darkness in the midst of our own ignorance and not knowing. And their job was to trim the lamps with the oil that sustained them. And to be honest, I had to Google what it means to trim a lamp. And I found that in the days before you could turn electricity on with a flip of a switch, burning oil in lamps required the care involved in trimming the wick, which drew the oil up from the storage reservoir so that the flame would be clean and bright, and a poorly trimmed wick created a flame which was dim and smoky. And I love that image, that we as the church, we as followers of Christ, are called to trim the wicks faithfully, to create a flame that lights a path, bright and clean and clear, to God's kingdom. Is your lamp showing the way? To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.